Today I'll teach you about the oxygen utilization and uptake. Why do you think that oxygen is consumed, is getting utilized? Because the tissues are respiring, that we know. In the last class I told you about that the tissues use up the oxygen to get energy. Now this utilization of oxygen means using up the oxygen. The oxygen is no longer available. That oxygen that we are utilizing is no longer available in this entire earth. Let it aside, like if we keep aside the factor that this oxygen is being consumed, means that if when we say that oxygen is consumed, means it is no longer, it is an irreversible, it's a chemical process that is taking place in our body, and this oxygen is getting consumed and it is getting converted into water. So while we utilize this oxygen, we need to know how this, what are the factors that will govern this utilization. What are the factors? How our body utilizes this oxygen. So there are numerous factors for this oxygen utilization. Means if you want to increase oxygen utilization, you cannot increase an oxygen utilization just staying at rest. Since there is a very wrong notion that I can increase my oxygen uptake staying at rest. It's only that when your body will metabolize heavily, will generate more ATP while you are doing much muscular work, then only oxygen utilization will rise. Otherwise oxygen utilization will never go up. And just breathing heavily, say I am sitting at rest and I am now breathing very heavily, and in that way oxygen utilization does not rise. Oxygen utilization is from the want for oxygen is from the within, is from within the body, is in the metabolizing muscles, in the working muscles. When they only consume that oxygen, that way oxygen utilization goes up. And just breathing heavily will just maybe wash out the carbon dioxide in our body. It will not add up more oxygen. It will not add up more oxygen to the blood. A little bit oxygen will be obviously there is a little deficiency will be filled up, but it is not that important. Important is if we breathe heavily, we wash out carbon dioxide from the body, because more carbon dioxide accumulating in the lungs will be washed out from the body. So now I'll come to a little bit about these factors of our oxygen utilization and uptake. See, our lungs is a very important. Our lungs are very important. Our lungs are very important in the uptake of oxygen. Uptake of oxygen means how oxygen is getting uptaken by the hemoglobin molecules. The hemoglobin molecules have a high affinity for oxygen, and in that way it is binding up the oxygen in the lungs. Now the cardiovascular system, the CV, this is called the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system, the cardiac output is also very important. Cardiac output, cardiac output is the blood that is getting ejected from the heart, and this heart will deliver this blood to the lung for oxygenation, for the adding up of oxygen. And this cardiac output becomes a very important factor, because unless and until our cardiovascular system means the blood ejecting out of the heart gets flown, it flows to the different organ. We have a blood pressure, because we have blood pressure, the blood flows through in the arteries to various organs, and without this blood pressure mechanisms, the blood will never go to the tissues. And if the blood never goes to the tissues, if the blood stops flowing, then there is no question of O2 utilization. Means O2 will not get delivered to the tissues. The tissues will not have O2 available. So O2 utilization in a tissue is very important. While we know that O2, how much a tissue utilizes, if the utilization becomes more, if the utilization becomes less, how that more and less goes on, because the tissues are metabolizing, and to the actively metabolizing tissue, the scenario is that to the actively metabolizing tissue, our cardiovascular system had made arrangements to make good blood flow to the tissues. Because if there is no good flow, good amount of flow to the tissues will not be able to have that oxygen in the blood that is bound to hemoglobin. So O2 delivery is a very important factor. You need to get the O2 need to get delivered through the blood. So there is a importance of this O2 delivery system. The O2 delivery system has to be very efficient. The blood has to flow, and the other factors are exchange adequacy. Exchange adequacy, what is meant by exchange adequacy? Means the exchange, because more the exchange adequacy, it's in the lung. The lung is an organ for exchange. The carbon dioxide getting out of the blood in the lungs helps oxygenation. So it's the exchange adequacy, and more carbon dioxide getting out, it will help more oxygenation. Because I just taught in the previous class that if the carbon dioxide gets removed from the blood, what happens is that the hemoglobin, if the carbon dioxide, the bicarbonate H2CO3 acid, the bicarbonic acid will get lowered, and because of this lowering of bicarbonic acids, what happens is that this the H plus ions falls, and these H plus ions falling, these H plus ions will lead to the release of those H hydrogens from the hemoglobin, and now hemoglobin will now progressively oxygenate. So the carbon dioxide removal from the blood is actually helping hemoglobin to get oxygenated. So this exchange, these are the exchange functions that are taking place in the lungs. Now at the same time, there is an importance of blood flow that I just told you. Then the capacity of the blood to carry oxygen. The capacity of the blood to carry oxygen is very important, because hemoglobin, if somebody has a lower hemoglobin percentage in his blood, if somebody is anemic, then what happens is that the anemic person will not be able to transport oxygen, because he has no transport molecule. Hemoglobin is the transport molecule. More you have cabs, more you can get transferred from your office to your home, or your school to your home, or for anywhere, you can go anywhere. So if the transport molecules, the hemoglobins are not present, if the cabs, if the cars, if the buses are not there, you cannot get transported. So if it is the deficiency of transport that happens while there is a person with low hemoglobin percentage. Normally our hemoglobin percentage for men is around 15 gram percent, means 15 grams per 100 ml blood, or per deciliter blood. So this is the capacity of the blood to carry oxygen. So if you lower the efficiency of hemoglobin with carbon monoxide poisoning, with other different gases, if there is a kind of toxicity inside the blood, so that the hemoglobin gets inefficient to carry oxygen, to hold oxygen, so the blood will not be able to carry oxygen. Then the other very important thing is vascular bed. Vascular bed. Every tissue has a vascular bed. The lung vascular bed is called pulmonary vascular bed. Vascular bed means the capillary beds, the small, very thin capillaries where RBCs travel in a file. Say it is a capillary. Say this is a capillary. Here the RBCs travel in a single file. The RBCs, that this biconcave in shape. So these are the RBCs. They travel in a single file. They travel with their membranes, the capillary membranes and the RBC membranes getting opposed to one another. They get in touch, so that the oxygen that is present inside this RBC, gets. These are the oxygens which gets liberated from the RBCs to the tissues. These are the oxygens which gets liberated from the RBC to the tissues. So this is the importance of vascular bed. The vascular bed has to be very open. It means if there is the vascular bed opens up. The pulmonary vascular bed in exercise, when the blood gets warmer, the vascular bed opens up. More blood goes into these vascular beds. In the tissues also, when your tissues get warm, when you are actively involved in a kind of, say, running or walking, you are actively involved in an exercise, you are actively involved in a workout. So at that time your capillaries in the tissues, your capillaries, your thin capillaries in the tissues gets opened up, and everywhere you find blood flow, and the tissues will look reddish, it will look healthy, it will not look pale. That means it will get warmer, and that vascular bed has opened up. So the vascular bed, actually the blood flow into this vascular bed is very important for oxygenation, for oxygen uptake and utilization. And the most important thing is hemoglobin. The most important thing is hemoglobin. This is the molecule, the hemoglobin percentage, and the O2 affinity of the hemoglobin. O2 affinity of the hemoglobin means O2 affinity of the hemoglobin has to lower down if the hemoglobin has to deliver the oxygen that he has taken it from the lungs. He has got a delivery to make. He has uploaded himself with the oxygen. Now he has to make the delivery to the tissues. He has to throw away the oxygen to the tissues. He has to liberate the oxygen to the tissues. So it has to reduce its affinity towards its oxygen. So there, in the tissue conditions, the hemoglobin lowers its affinity. The tissue conditions, the affinity of the hemoglobin is lowered. Actually, hemoglobin cannot do that. The tissue conditions affect the hemoglobin molecule to lower its affinity, and so the oxygen gets delivered to the tissues. Now, hemoglobin is a complex molecule. It is made up of proteins, as well as it is made up of a very important carbon nitrogen moiety, which is called porphyrin. Porphyrin, porphyrin rings. And these porphyrin rings, in the center of this porphyrin rings, you have iron atoms. Irons which are present in ferrous state. Iron, can be present in ferrous as well as ferric state. So it is present in ferrous state, in the reduced state. And the hemoglobin molecule has this long, big porphyrin carbon nitrogen chains. These are the carbon nitrogen chains, porphyrin chains. And in the center of these four porphyrin chain, you have the iron in the ferrous state. And all this, there are four porphyrin chains in the hemoglobin, and with each porphyrin ring, with each this is a ring. This is actually a ring. I will join the edges here. This is actually a ring, and in the center you have the iron. And if the center and each iron atom in the center can have a single oxygen bound to it, and so there are four porphyrin rings, so there are four oxygen molecules. So if you want to write hemoglobin, you can write it as like this, that Hb4 means four porphyrins of the hemoglobin binding to 8 oxygen atoms, each porphyrin ring binding to 1 oxygen. So there are 4 porphyrin rings in the hemoglobin, so Hb4 binding to 8 oxygen atoms. So just a quick revision, hemoglobin molecule is heme. Hb is equal to two things, heme, H-A-E-M, heme, and globin. Globin are the protein part. This is the protein part, heme and globin. So the heme is actually what? The heme is actually porphyrin ring. It is a porphyrin ring. It's a carbon nitrogen large ring of carbon and nitrogen, and in the center of this ring you have the iron atoms in ferrous state, and this iron atoms will bind 4 oxygen, and this type of oxygenation is actually important, very important for hemoglobin to hold up the 8 oxygens. And this follows a little bit different kinetics. I'll go into that. Means each of these iron atoms do not have this same affinity for oxygen. It will not bind to this oxygen with the same affinity, means it doesn't have that amount of affinity for the porphyrin rings are somehow manipulated by the globin chains. How? Because these globin chains bind to this porphyrin ring in a tight way, and when this tight binding is there, the porphyrin rings don't bind iron. It means it has squeezed up the porphyrin ring, and this squeezing up of this porphyrin ring has eliminated the oxygen. Now, if somehow oxygen manages to go inside this porphyrin ring, then this binding gets looser, and if the first oxygen binds to a porphyrin ring, it gets looser. It gets looser, and it gets looser on the other porphyrin ring. The other porphyrin ring will now the globins will less tightly now bind to the other porphyrin ring also, and in that way the globin will get loose, and another oxygen addition in this porphyrin ring will happen. Then if these two oxygens will now influence the third oxygen, to bind more easily to the hemoglobin. And so this is what I have written. See, these are the tense and very tense globin molecules in the deoxyglobin state, tense and tight, and this is called the T state of the deoxyhemoglobin molecule. And now when this tense state has gone to relaxed, and see, I have opened up gaps here, huge gaps here. It becomes relaxed. So this is the relaxed form, and this relaxed form will take up the oxygen. Will take this when oxygen goes inside this tense form, this form will get relaxed. When oxygen gets inside this tense form, the hemoglobin gets relaxed. The relaxation adds up more to oxygen additions, more oxygen additions. See, these oxygen additions, and these oxygen additions will add up. So you see. So if this molecule gets somehow relaxed, there is an increase in 500-fold increase in the oxygen affinity, and it is actually progressive increase, and this is actually a progressive increase. The first oxygen getting added up to the heme will let the other oxygen bind more easily. The first and the second, when bound together, will attract the third oxygen, and it will come bind. It will kind of invite, and this is kind of a progressive increase in affinity. The hemoglobin has now a progressive increase in affinity towards oxygen. And this process is reversible. Because oxygen binding to the hemoglobin takes place in the lung, and the oxygen release takes place in the tissues. Now I'll come into a little bit about the amounts of oxygen and the amount of oxygen and amount of those things. How much oxygen we need, how much oxygen. See, at resting state, when we are at rest, we need around, say, 250 ml of oxygen per minute. That then you will try to you'll ask me about how this 250 ml, how did you know this, how this 250 ml of oxygen per minute is consumed. This is made by some kind of laboratory where oxygen uptake is being measured. So if we put out our respiratory gases inside a chamber called Douglas bag, and then if we inside this Douglas bag, if we breathe out inside the Douglas bag, say this is the Douglas bag, a big leather bag, where we breathing out we are breathing out a person breathing out while exercising, while the person is exercising. If we breathes out the air, and this air, he takes in the air from the atmosphere, and he breathes out into this Douglas bag. Now if the atmospheric air, there is a percentage of oxygen, and in this exhaled air, in this expired air, there is a percentage of oxygen, and say after 5, if I record, say after 5 minutes, I take the total volume, say this Douglas bag has accumulated a volume, you have expired in, repeated cycles of expiration has taken place in 5 minutes, and the bag is now full. Say the bag is 80 liters now, so 80 liters. So if this 80 liters of gas is there in the Douglas bag, you know the atmospheric percentage, of oxygen, it is around 21%, and this Douglas bag contains say about 16% oxygen, and it contains 80 liter of air. So 80 liter containing 60%, here 80 liters of atmospheric air will contains 21%. So you will, from this, by simple mathematics, you can calculate the oxygen that is getting deficient inside this expired air, that the oxygen that is being deficient. Why the oxygen is getting deficient? Because oxygen is being taken up by our body, and absorbed in our lung, and the expired air contains more carbon dioxide and contains more oxygen. So in this way we can measure oxygen uptake. So it's a very simple setup of the laboratory. Anyway, I'll not go into details of this. So this is about, now I'll tell you about a little bit about the oxygen amounts, how this oxygen, a little bit about those details of this. Say 250 ml of oxygen we consume at rest. It's very important that we tell our physical activity condition. Means it can go up to 25 times this oxygen uptake. It can go up to 25 times of this 250. 10 times of this 250 ml goes to 2.5 liters. 20 times can go up to 2.5 liters. Is 250 into 10. 250 into 10 is 250 into 10 equal to 2500, means 2500 ml, that is 2.5 liters. 2.5 liters. It can go, if it goes to 10 times, if it goes to 20 times, it will go to, say it will go to double of 10 times, means it can increase to 5 liters. Even it can increase to 25 times in vigorous exercise. That is the maximal oxygen uptake that a person can take. Athletes, generally the elite athletes, marathoner kind athletes, they consume the oxygen during their events 25 times of this values. So normally, generally, we can say that oxygen uptake at rest is 250. It can go up to even 25 times. And 20 times is 5 liters. Another 5 times is around say 1.2 liters. So it will be around 5 to 6 liters of oxygen consumption at a huge amount of exercise. So how come this 250 ml is arrived at? How come this body? I'll go to the dynamics of that. Let us see how our oxygen is. I just told you in the last class that our hemoglobin, how much our hemoglobin can carry, and how much hemoglobin is present. Say our body contains, we know 15 gram percent hemoglobin. That means our body contains per 100 ml of blood carries 15 grams of hemoglobin. And in the last class I told you that each gram, 1 gram of hemoglobin can carry 1.34 ml of oxygen. When this hemoglobin is 100% saturated. when this hemoglobin is 100% saturated. Each gram of hemoglobin will carry 1.35 ml of oxygen. So what is 15 into 15 grams of hemoglobin is present. So 15 into 1.35, it will come to around, say, 15 5s are 75, 15 3s are 45, 45 plus 7 is 52, 15 plus 5 is 20. So it is 20 point something. So this ml, each gram can carry 1.35 ml. So 15 gram can carry 1.35 into 15, that is around 20 ml of oxygen. So 20 ml of oxygen is present there when 100 ml of blood, is fully saturated, the 20 ml per 100 ml of blood. Every deciliter of blood, when fully saturated with oxygen, due to the presence of hemoglobin, it can carry 20 ml of blood, 20 ml of oxygen. Every ml of blood carries 20 ml of oxygen, because each gram of hemoglobin can carry 1.35 ml of oxygen, and so 15 grams will carry 15 into 1.35, that is 20.25 or 20 you can say 21 ml of oxygen. So 20, I'll prefer to write 20 ml of oxygen. So 20 ml of oxygen is present inside the arterial blood, the blood that is getting flown from the lungs, and it flows down to the heart, and the heart distributes that blood with the left heart pumping out the blood. It distributes the blood to the whole body tissues, and this is actually containing, each 100 ml portion of this blood carries around 20 ml. Now you need to know in a minute how much blood is coming. So in a minute we know that cardiac output means the blood coming out of the heart. Every minute our heart beats 70 times a minute, and with every beat it ejects 70 ml of blood. So 70 times into 70 ml, it is actually cardiac. This is the heart rate, because this is our heart rate, and this is the amount of blood that the heart ejects into the body with every beat. So 70 into 70 is 4900 ml, which is actually 5 liters, because it is our normal heart rate is 72, so another 140 gets added up, because 2 into 70 is 140, another 140 gets added up, so it becomes 4900 becomes plus 140 becomes 5040 ml, and this is actually 5 liters. So I can write it as 5 liters. So let's see what this thing means. So 5 liters of blood getting ejected out of the heart every minute, and each of this in this 5 liters, say there are 5000 ml, and 5000 ml means 50 times. If I can write 5000 ml as 50 times 100 ml, 50 times 100 ml, and each 100 ml can carry 20 ml of oxygen. Each 100 ml of blood can carry 20 ml of oxygen. So 50 into 20, and this blood, after it returns into the tissue, returns from the tissues, when it climbs down the vein and gets delivered again to the heart, when this blood has delivered this oxygen, So the tissue, so inside the tissues, when the oxygenated blood arrives, it arrives at around 20 ml per dl. 20 ml per dl. Now the tissues, in the tissues, the oxygen goes out of the in the tissues, and this oxygen will get utilized, and the blood will become venous blood. Blood will become venous blood, and this venous blood will carry more carbon dioxide, because the tissues has added up those their carbon dioxide inside the blood, and it will contain lesser oxygen. And if you see the venous blood oxygen content, you will see that it is around, say it is 5 ml less than this. So there is an oxygen extraction from the blood. 5 ml has gone low. Every 100 ml, 5 ml of oxygen is not there. So it is around, say, 15 ml present in the venous blood. The venous blood contains 15 ml per dl. Venous blood O2 content. Is 15 ml per dl. So there is a 5 ml extraction, and this extraction goes higher and higher when you exercise. When you exercise, more of this extraction goes out, more of this extraction mechanism operates, and this extraction mechanism can increase in huge number of times. Means it can increase, say, 10 times this extraction mechanism. So this volume of oxygen will also get extracted to the tissues, and we call it arteriovenous oxygen difference. Arteriovenous oxygen difference means in the arteries you have 20 ml of oxygen, and in the veins, in the arteries you have 20 ml of oxygen, and in the veins you have 15 ml of oxygen. So 5 ml has got extracted. So this is called the arteriovenous oxygen difference, or the amount of extraction of our tissues. When the tissues are actively metabolizing, they are completely extracting this amount of oxygen. So in the arterial blood, what happens is that the arterial blood contains around, say, 75% oxygen in the normal resting state. The arterial blood contains around 75% oxygen, and this reduction, there is a reduction of, say, 25%, because the arterial blood contains around 97 to 98% oxygen. It is not 100%, because the lung blood flows and the cardiac blood flows that are get admixtured in the blood that comes out from the lungs. So there is a little bit reduction. So the arterial blood is around, the blood that gets out of the left ventricle is 100% saturated. But this saturation lowers to 97%, 97 to 98%, and this percentage lowering. So we can say that actually the blood that we are getting in from the heart is actually 100%. If the arterial blood is 100% saturated, so it is, so that is not that important. The important is that what is the difference of the oxygen saturation in the arterial blood and the venous blood. That will tell us about our bodily extraction of oxygen. If the bodily extraction is more, the difference will be more. And normally at rest there is only from this 97 to 98%, there is a reduction of around, say, the oxygen content is 75%. So there is a reduction of around, say, 20 to 22% of oxygen content in the blood, and this 20 to 20%, 97 to 75% saturation of hemoglobin. Now if you have little bit difficulty in understanding these percentages, I'll tell you about I'll go into the details of the percentage the percentage saturations. These percentages are of saturation of hemoglobin. See, cis saturation of hemoglobin means if hemoglobin can hold say around say 1 gram of hemoglobin, I just told you 1 gram of hemoglobin can hold around say 1.34 ml of oxygen. So if this is 100% saturation, means this is his full capacity. The full capacity of the hemoglobin to hold the oxygen is, when it is utilizing its full capacity, is 134. Say if it is 6.5 ml, 0.65 ml. So it is half. So it is, we call it 50% oxygen, 50% saturation. So it is, if it is say lesser than this, 0.65, so we will reduce by, it will get reduced by 30%. Say 1 ml, 1 gram of hemoglobin is holding around 1 ml oxygen. 1 ml of oxygen. So it is not 100% saturation, because when it is 100% saturated, it will contain 1.34 ml of oxygen. Now it is 1 ml, so it is lower. Say it is around 75% level. So these are this is the percentage saturation. It is how much oxygen per gram of hemoglobin is actually the percentage saturation, and this percentage saturation is very important because it allows us to plot the hemoglobin dissociation curve. Hemoglobin dissociation curve that I'll come to. What is the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve? Hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve is a very simple relation of hemoglobin with that of oxygen, and this relation hemoglobin with oxygen binding and release. It can bind oxygen and release, but this binding and release will depend on what? On what? This binding and release of oxygen. Hemoglobin, when it is present inside the lung, it is facing huge amount of oxygen in the lung. The partial pressure of oxygen inside the lung is high. As you know that atmospheric air has a partial pressure of 152 millimeter of mercury. Oxygen partial pressure, because atmosphere, why 152? Because atmospheric air pressure is 760 millimeter of mercury, and oxygen contains 20% of this air is oxygen. So 20%, 20 by 100 of 760 mm of mercury is around, it is the partial pressure, because oxygen occupies only 20%. So it is 20% of this total pressure. The total atmospheric pressure is 760. So 20% of this total pressure is around 0.000, 2 zeros cut out. This is around 176 into 2 is 152 millimeter of mercury. So partial pressure of 152 millimeter of mercury is a partial pressure of atmospheric air. But lung air, there is a reduction. You know that because of dead space, there is a reduction of percentage of oxygen. There is a reduction of partial pressure of oxygen in the lung air, because while you breathe in and breathe out, there is always a dead space interfering. I'll come to that later. Anyway, we know, because I wanted here to let you know about this hemoglobin oxygen curve. I'll be very focused on this hemoglobin oxygen curve, and I'll not divert to anything of that in this class. Now this, because the atmospheric air contains 152 millimeter of mercury, the partial pressure of oxygen is 152 millimeter of mercury. It is partial pressure is denoted by P, small p, O2. The partial pressure of oxygen is 152 millimeter of mercury in the atmospheric air. In the lung air, because you need to know this little bit amount, in the lung air the partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeter of mercury. It is somehow lower to 100 millimeter of mercury. But in the tissues, our partial pressure of oxygen is very low. It is around say 40 millimeter of mercury. So when the hemoglobin is facing 100 millimeter of mercury oxygen partial pressure, and oxygen will now diffuse out, because in the blood it is only 40. The venous blood, it is only 40. The blood has come to the lung, it is facing it has got spread out in the lung, and the RBCs are facing a huge amount of oxygen in the alveoli. So the alveoli is the partial, because the oxygen will diffuse into the oxygen, and huge amount of oxygen is getting diffused into the, because there is a difference in partial pressure. You know that because of this Graham's law of partial pressure, you know that because diffusion takes place from a region of higher pressure to a region of lower pressure. So oxygen diffuses inside our body, and it is being captured by the hemoglobin, which is a very specialized molecule to capture and bind oxygen. So there is a relationship by all this thing. I just wanted to tell you that there is a relationship between the partial pressure increase of partial pressure will increase O2 content of blood. As the oxygen gets delivered to the hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin will now hold up. So if we now want to relate these two things, that O2 content of blood, it is expressed in O2 where this O2 content of blood gets increased, because O2 gets delivered into the hemoglobin. So the hemoglobin percentage has to rise. So hemoglobin percentage with this partial pressure of oxygen, if we relate these two things, there happens to be a relation. If you relate these two things, there happens to be a curve. A curve which is called the hemoglobin dissociation curve, HbO2 dissociation curve. Let's draw that curve. So the relation is like that. HbO2 dissociation curve. If I plot in this y-axis the hemoglobin percentages, Hb percentages means if the Hb is 100% saturated, it will contain 1.34 ml of oxygen, and if the oxygen content of 1 gram of hemoglobin is less than 134, if it is less than 134, then it is lesser than 100%. So if this is 100% containing 1 gram of hemoglobin containing 1.34 ml of oxygen, and I lower it 100, 90, 80, 70, 60% saturation, 50% saturation, 40% saturation, 30% saturation. So these are the lowerings of the saturation, hemoglobin saturation, percentage hemoglobin saturation. And this is 100% hemoglobin saturation. This hemoglobin contains 1 gram of hemoglobin contains 1.34 ml of oxygen. And this is the why will this saturation fall? Why will this saturation fall? Because there will be lowering of oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues. There will be, if the partial pressure falls, the hemoglobin will progressively liberate its oxygen. So say these are the partial pressures increasing from here. If I draw a relation between the partial pressure of oxygen that the hemoglobin is facing, the relation will be like this, and this is called the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Now you have to get into the intricate details of this curve. So during the first part, during this first part of progressive increase of partial pressure, if the partial pressure was increasing, the hemoglobin percentages were rising very steeply. See, this is the difference in partial pressure. This difference in partial pressure has resulted in this very steep portion of this curve, and it has resulted in the difference of partial pressure of hemoglobin, say around 10, 20, 30, 40% hemoglobin has got saturated with the difference of this difference of partial pressure. But here in this part, with the same difference of partial pressure, like this, the same difference of partial pressure, the hemoglobin has only the difference of oxygenation. See, and if we plot it here, this point and this corresponding this point, this is the little bit difference, the small difference. The same difference of partial pressure, the hemoglobin is now not allowing in more oxygen. So there is a little bit difference in the hemoglobin percentage saturation. This little bit difference. Say if this was 95, this is 97. Only a 2% difference. But here the same increase of partial pressure has resulted in a radical 45% increase of of hemoglobin oxygen content. So how? So this is the steeper portion of the curve. This is the steeper portion of the curve. This is the steeper portion of the curve, steep portion, and this is the flat portion of the curve. The flat portion of the curve. The curve has gone flat, and the curve is steeper here. The steeper rise of this curve. The steeper rise, and here the curve has got flat. It has got flat, horizontal, and this is the steep portion of the curve. Why is it so? And this shape is like more or less like this S shaped or sigmoid shaped. Now because this part of this curve is climbing very high, it has resulted in the stem of this S, and this curve is getting flat, it has resulted in the flattened portion of this S later. Now why does this happen? This is because of cooperative binding. Cooperative binding means when some hemoglobin is initially it was slow. Now when some hemoglobin has got its oxygens, it has oxygen, it has started binding oxygens more rapidly. So the curve is like very steep in this region, and it goes flat there. Again, because there is a saturation, it is reaching saturation. It has got flattened. It is reaching saturation, it can bind no longer, it has already got saturated. So the initial flat portions, initial lower rises is because the hemoglobin was not that efficient in binding oxygen. More and more of oxygen are getting added to hemoglobin. It is becoming a more versatile molecule. It is becoming a more efficient molecule of binding to oxygen. So this progressive oxygenation, just I discussed previously, this progressive oxygenation of hemoglobin is letting the other oxygens, the pathway of the other oxygens to bind to that hemoglobin easier. The pathway becomes easier, and it is because of this reason that the curve gets steeper. With a little bit increase of partial pressure, the hemoglobin is now eating up more oxygen, is now binding up more oxygen. Another very significant thing about this partial pressure is around, say, this is 75% mark of, this is 75% saturation of hemoglobin, and this is 97% saturation. This is the 97% saturation. So this point is the 97% saturation. This part of deoxygenation, it is a process of deoxygenation. Some blood arriving into the tissues, getting deoxygenated to 75% of its value, of its O2 content, 75% of its O2 content, and this deoxygenation is what happens. This amount of deoxygenation is normally what happens during rest. If there is active vigorous exercise in the muscles, the deoxygenations, the vigorously exercising muscles, the PO2 falls to still lower levels. Say this PO2 is around 60 millimeter of mercury, and if the PO2 falls below 60 millimeter of mercury, from this point there is a very sharp fall, because the hemoglobin will liberate, with little bit decrease of PO2, the hemoglobin will liberate huge amount of oxygen. The hemoglobin will liberate huge amount of oxygen. So the hemoglobin becomes a very highly efficient molecule for delivering oxygen, at lower PO2s. At lower tissue PO2s, when the PO2 of the tissues is lower, because muscles are now utilizing more oxygen, and so the PO2 is getting lower and lower, and the hemoglobin, okay fine, hemoglobin will give the support. Hemoglobin will, if this curve would not get down that steep, so hemoglobin is not supporting. In here, hemoglobin is not supporting because the curve is not getting down. It is still holding up 97% saturation. It is still holding up. So any hemoglobin curve which assumes this kind of shape and it moves to the left of this curve. Any hemoglobin curve which moves to the left of this curve, it is actually holding up oxygen. If there is a modification of hemoglobin which holds up oxygen, so the curve will be shifted towards the left, means at lower PO2s the hemoglobin is not releasing, but this release is reflected. See, the release of this curve is reflected by a sharp downfall. From anywhere around 60 millimeter of mercury PO2, there is a sharp downfall. Means the hemoglobin is losing oxygen. If the hemoglobin is not losing oxygen, it will now stay here or get even like this. So this hemoglobin is losing oxygen here at this PO2. Up to here it is holding up oxygen. It is maintaining its saturation. This hemoglobin is maintaining its saturation up to here. At this PO2 it is maintaining its saturation. After that it is delivering. So this is the delivery part. This is the oxygen extraction part. So if the hemoglobin, if you make a certain modifications in hemoglobin, the hemoglobin will shift to the left. If you have modifications in hemoglobin, it can shift to the right. When we say that the curve has shifted to the right of this curve, we say that when this curve is shifted towards the right, we say the dissociation is favored. Means the hemoglobin will lose more oxygen. It will start losing oxygen. Say from here, it has started losing oxygen, and it is to the right of this curve. So any shift towards the right of this curve, towards the right of this normal curve, of this, say this is of normal hemoglobin, and this is of a hemoglobin which is somehow modified. This curve, this hemoglobin curve, if it shifts towards the right, we say that it can release. It's a better molecule for release. And if the curve is shifted towards the left, we say that it's a better molecule of holding up. So generally, our myoglobin molecules, means the molecules that bind to oxygen inside the red muscle fibers. Where oxygen is present, we have the myoglobin molecules holding up oxygen. So myoglobin molecules can snatch, it can take away the hemoglobin oxygen, because the myoglobins are like here, the myoglobin curves are like here to the left, because they can still hold the oxygen. So at this PO2, say at this point, the hemoglobin, this PO2, myoglobin can hold, say, more percentage of oxygen. Say myoglobin can hold 95%, hemoglobin can hold 80% oxygen. So there is a difference in percentages that the myoglobin can hold if this curve is of myoglobin. So myoglobin curves are to the left of hemoglobin curves, so they have more affinity of binding. At lower oxygen levels they can still hold up the oxygen, and so they have higher affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin, and because of that myoglobin molecules can snatch up, can take away the hemoglobin oxygen and deliver it to the tissues. Generally the red muscle fibers contains myoglobin molecules, and so because the myoglobin molecule dissociation curve is towards the left, that means at every point of this PO2, at all these PO2, it can hold up. If the PO2 gets lowered, it can still hold up its percentages. If the PO2 gets lowered, it can still hold up its percentages. That's reflected by the flatness of the curve in this portion. The myoglobin curve will be like this kind of thing. It will be to the right of the hemoglobin curve. So addition. So if then what are the changes? Then what are the changes that the hemoglobin molecule generally have? If the hemoglobin molecule arrives in the tissue, the tissues are warmer. So the tissue temperature is higher. There are more acids, metabolic acids. The pH is lower in the tissues, and you will find that the actively metabolizing muscles will contain more acids, more acids of metabolism of glycolysis. Say phosphoglyceric acid gets converted to all these acids gets converted by the lipopolymering cycle that we know, this lipopolymering cycle of formation of glyceric acid, diphosphoglyceric acids. This 2,3-diphosphoglyceric acid is a byproduct of glycolysis, which is formed inside the muscles, inside the red blood cells. And these acids of glycolysis of increased metabolism actually lower the pH, and these lowering of pH, lowering of temperature shifts the curve to the right. So the hemoglobin cannot hold that oxygen. It has to liberate that oxygen. Because the hemoglobin now is painted with hydrogen ions. It is in an acidic environment. It is now painted with hydrogen ions, and this hemoglobin will no longer get can hold up the oxygen, and it liberates. So the curve shifts to the right. So this hemoglobin dissociation curve shifts to the right. When this hemoglobin arrives in the lung, the lung has lower temperature than that of our active body tissues, because the lungs are cold, because air comes in from the atmosphere, we breathe in, the air is colder than our body temperature. So because of the breathing cycles that happens in the lung, the air gets moistened and the lungs are much cooler than our body. So because of this lowering of temperature in the lung, the hemoglobin faces a different condition in the lung, and the oxygen that is present in the lung makes the whole blood alkaline. Oxygen is an alkaline gas, and because of this alkalinity, alkalinity means increase of pH. The increase in alkalinity, the lowering of temperature, the hydrogen ions goes away from the hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin gets better molecule to bind to oxygen, and so the hemoglobin affinity goes up, and the curve and the hemoglobin, if this is the average, it goes to the left. Means its affinity gets increased, and so hemoglobin will bind more oxygen to it. So this shifting takes place. These are the different conditions of hemoglobin facing, the different conditions that the hemoglobin faces. The hemoglobin faces in the lungs, then the hemoglobin faces in the tissues. The curve shifts to the right, and so we can deliver our oxygen. Because of such a nature of this hemoglobin molecule, we can deliver oxygen to the tissues. We can take up oxygen and we can deliver oxygen. Thank you for listening so patiently about this thing, about this hemoglobin oxygenation and dissociation curve. Next day I'll come to Bohr effect. Thank you.